To be a coconut is to be whitewashed. So Americanized, only your skin carries the evidence of your true roots. To be a coconut is to realize that your vowels don't sound right in Hindi. My mouth curls around foreign sounds, hoping that if the embrace is tight enough, then maybe they'll start to fit. Fit in the same way English has made its home on my tongue, in my mouth, my throat, my soul. When my grandparents speak with history on their breath, those years of stories turn to ash in my mouth. I started writing poetry because I was angry. Not loud anger, but the quiet kind that festers in your bones when you realize the life you're living came with the pre-written instructions that came long before you were even born. You see, at home, there was the daughter who would carry forward everything that came before her. The language, the traditions, the legacy that spanned an entire ocean. And outside the home, there was another set of instructions entirely, one that asked me to smooth out the nuances of myself that didn't quite translate right into English. And somewhere in between both, wedged was me, something new entirely. Poetry was my safe haven. It was how I could ask questions no one else seemed comfortable asking and dissect the answers I got piece by piece. And for a while, that was enough. But when I became Youth Poet Laureate of Alameda County, the world began to treat my voice like it belonged to the community. Poetry was no longer just a confession, it was representation. I became a kind of vessel, the trophy proof that youth could be articulate. Kids would come up to me after performances and look at me like I was something awe-inspiring, like I had the answers to their questions, when ironically I was still looking for answers to mine. It was why I began to censor myself, not wanting to convey something I'd later regret. It was easier to soften myself, to be the version that was more palatable, honest, but not too honest, messy, but only in an inspiring way. One sunny afternoon, and Mom pulls out a photo of me and her twinning in matching lehengas, my muddy feet barely visible at the bottom of the frame. She laughs, calls me wild child, and I am taken back a decade ago. Back in the body of an 8-year-old, tearing down the streets barefoot, arms pumping, pants splattered in paint. Mom never got why I hated wearing shoes. Why I picked gravel, indenting bruises over socks. I'd come home with scrapes all over my legs and wear shorts even in the middle of winter. How could I have told her that the ground under my feet called to me? The grass against my toes, wild child trying to feel rooted, wild child trying to feel free, a spirit confined in earthly shackles, trying to go back home. My parents never taught me poetry. They taught me silence, the kind that sits at the dinner table and makes inheritance feel like a burden. My dad in particular was never accustomed to many outward emotions, so when I was in the 8th grade, I wrote an essay on his forehead wrinkles. It sounds absurd, I know, but for my own amusement, I spent an entire afternoon penning down a thesis on what the shape and angle of each line meant. It was my way of decoding him. Because you see, his history was never spoken of as poetry. It was more like a cautionary script we had to follow, or at least do our best not to dishonor. It wasn't until the summer after my senior year of high school, in Las Vegas of all places, that things finally started to change. He came to me one night and said that he hoped I made the most out of college, that he didn't care what grades I got, but what I learned. Now, hearing this, I was stunned. My dad, who stressed perfect grades growing up, was suddenly telling me he didn't care anymore. He just turned to me and said, "Kiddo, back in 1997, I came from a small third-tier town in India. There wasn't a lot of opportunity, and an American degree would have meant opportunity. But there wasn't any internet either, so all of my college brochures came from the American embassy. How was I supposed to know if I got into an actually good college or not?" He paused, thinking a bit. "You know, it was a miracle I even got my first job. No large company wanted to take a kid who wasn't from Stanford or Berkeley, and no small company wanted to sponsor an international student for a non-technical role. So, before one of my interviews, I went out and I bought a book on the basics of coding and I taught it to myself. I'd worked in a computer lab for a bit, and that was on my resume, so they didn't ask me too many questions. In fact, you could say that my career didn't actually begin until 2 years later when I finally transferred into the finance department. Now, hearing this, my head spun. For the first time, my parents began opening up to me about their lives, about trying to build a life in the US despite starting with so little. And all of a sudden, things started to make sense. I thought about my dad never speaking Hindi at home so his kids would sound right in English. I thought about my mom wanting to give us any opportunity we asked for and not let us see the toll it was taking on her. I'd spent my entire childhood thinking that lineage was a burden you were born into by chance. It was lines of loss etched into my dad's forehead that I'd learned to measure. My parents' decisions, from their lives to choosing how to raise me, was a byproduct of a lineage I never chose. But it was also ultimately just a choice. It was now up to me to decide what would carry forward and what would transform. And we storytellers will speak. History on our tongues, remembrance for those who were deemed fit to write their own stories. The irony will be hidden in our fables, the true tucked away and disguised revolutionaries working in code. So I like to think that she knew. My grandmother, who looked at me and saw the storyteller waiting inside. She calls and tells me, Hindi mein baat kar. Speak in your mother's tongue and her mother's tongue. Speak in our tongues for all our tongues. After that conversation with my parents, I could see a shift in my writing. I began to rewrite some of my childhood memories in the eyes of an adult. My poem about my grandmother was one of my favorites, a nod to the legacy I was now trying to relearn under a new light. And I realized the students opting into my poetry workshops were opting into my voice the same way I chose to carry parts of my parents' histories and their inherited struggles. After one of my poetry readings, a girl came up to me, shifting nervously as she handed me her notebook. She said she didn't know if her work was any good. And she pointed to a line she'd read. It said, "I am living in a home built on bones." And with each line she read, she began to speed up, like she was afraid of taking up too much of my time. So I told her, slow down. Your poem has its own rhythm, let it breathe. I pointed to the way she'd broken the lines and said, look, you already know where the pauses are. Don't write the way that you think a poem is supposed to sound. Write the way that you sound. And she looked at me like, but what if it's wrong? And she reminded me so much of myself. The doubt, the desire to adapt in order to be heard, I wanted better for her. So I told her it won't, because it's yours. And we sat together and she read me some more, and some lines were messy, some were sharp, some were unfinished, but they were real and they were hers. Because that story she was telling me was one I once claimed as my own, but she told it differently with her own unique history. It's been a few years since then, and I still think of her very often. We've both written our own immigrant stories and spoken about what it's like living outside of our family's boundaries. I have learned, lost, and wandered down beaten paths my parents never even dreamt of. My poems have matured with me, no longer struggling to find my place between two separate identities, but learning to accept the unique blend of cultural inheritance that is my own. You see, I think there seems to be a collective itch in our blood, not just to inherit, but to understand. And perhaps that is what America asks of us at its best. Not blind continuity, but to make that difficult choice of inheritance with intention. I am writing my own legacy. one that will undoubtedly constrain my descendants just as it did me and everyone who came before us. But I will also tell them the stories. Because you see, lineage is not just a prescriptive responsibility. It is responsibility with the potential of freedom. And we get to choose what we keep.